My guest tonight is Joe Atwill. He returns to the show. Joe, how you doing?
Good. How are you, Timothy?
Very well. Listen, Joe, thank you for coming back on the show. Joe is a researcher and independent scholar. He's the author of Shakespeare's Secret Messiah and Caesar's Messiah, the Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus. His website is postliviana.org. Joe also co-hosts The Secret Society Revealed, a weekly podcast that is carried on the Revolutionary Radio Network. That's on Friday now, isn't it?
Friday, yes, at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time.
Oh, great. Yeah, okay. And, Joe, you've done some recent podcasts where you've tied Alfred Kinsey to Aleister Crowley, the Rockefellers, the American Jewish Committee, and to MK Ultra. Through these connections, I think you've identified the various groups or factions that comprise what Ken Kesey called the Combine.
Yes, indeed. That was the purpose of the research, and that's what I attempted to do, was to determine the identity of the secret society that has slithered into control over our political, financial, and media worlds.
Now, through these groups, through these secret societies, these networks, clandestine networks, very powerful, very wealthy, influential, they control the media, they control pretty much control the economy through the banks, central banks. They can engage in high-level criminality in what is best described as organized malevolence. And so let's get into this. You've Alfred Kinsey, this academic weirdo, I guess.
Right. I mean,
somehow became a cult figure. How did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, Kinsey is a crackpot in terms of his science. It's almost painful to talk about Kinsey as an individual because he's so neurotic. He had a fixation of putting instruments up his penis, and some of them ended up being too gruesome to talk about. He did this because he claimed he had homosexual fantasies and he wanted to punish himself. So then he, his methodology is simply preposterous. I mean, he would, among other things, collect the sex diaries of pedophiles. And then he would try to organize the pedophile sex diaries into data, and then from there go out and draw conclusions. He had all kinds of methodology which has never really been disclosed. I mean, no one really knows exactly how the hard data that he was basing his claims upon, was organized. He ended up with very high fractions of the population as having homosexual or marital infidelity, various what could be seen at that time as sexual perversion. So he saw this very high fraction of the population. Later researchers couldn't replicate his data. And of course, the way it was organized was just absurd. So the question is, well, how did he become sort of like an icon? And there was really two ways. One, the media picked him up. The media just used him as though he was, basically the Thomas guide of human life experience. They just produced all of this, his information and media components as the truth. They didn't really put him under any kind of scrutiny. And then magazines like Playboy magazine, would reference him whenever there was someone was challenging what they were doing as being culturally debasement. They would say, well, you just don't know, the degree of the population that actually has these feelings and how normal they are. And so Kinsey was very much a component of the debasement of culture. In other words, if you look at where we are now, right, you have the pornography, you have family production at extremely low levels. You have out-of-wedlock births basically just through the roof. So how did we get here? How did you come from the 1950s, and turn all of these long-standing statistical bulwarks of culture and civilization on their head and end up where we are today with what can be described as basically a degenerate and pornographic culture. Well, it was, the media's one of the reasons, one of the ways we got there was through this use of Kinsey's science. Kinsey was also promoted by the political class. FDR gave him his own, attorney. And this was a close confidant of FDR, who was actually very, very powerful. And his name's I can't recall it right now. I believe it was Wallace. But this individual...
Was it Weschler?
Pardon me?
Weschler?
Weschler, thank you. Yeah, it was Weschler. So Weschler promoted legislation that would support this new reality of our sexual nature that Kinsey had brought to our attention. And so Weschler had a two-prong attack. One, he just actually created legislation, model legislation, and then sent it out to the state legislatures to change the state's sexual mores and laws. But he also started the process by changing the nature of law schools so that instead of teaching basically how to enforce the law and how to prosecute criminality as the focus of law school, they changed and became basically advocacy training, right? So that lawyers would then know how to sue the states and local communities to affect, FDR's vision of, different kind of social programs and this new morality that they wanted to hoist on the American people. And so what happens then is that the sovereignty of the individual sovereigns, in other words, you have, the towns, the cities, the counties, and the states, which under the original Constitution, the old one, before we had the modern version that we have to deal with now, these areas had sovereignty. They could make their own sexual mores. They could make their own legislation, and have regulations against homosexuality, pedophilia, things like this. And so that was basically taken away, and the federal law then trumped the small sovereignties, and it really stems from Weschler, who worked with FDR, to bring this about, to make this change. And so one of the things that really manifested from the change was the change in the laws regulating sexual morality. And basically the small sovereigns all lost the capacity to regulate it. And so then you end up with, in the 60s, you have another phase of the attack against American culture took place beginning with Gordon Wasson, with his participation in MK Ultra to bring about the psychedelic revolution. This was, of course, a government project. It was to go basically, hand in glove with the new laws. The laws would permit sexual exploration, and the media would promote these new lifestyles. You have Woodstock, where basically rock and roll, drugs, and sex out of wedlock, obviously, are all just forced into the minds of all the young people. And so this conjunction of these programs had the effect that was desired, and you started to have the family disintegrate. And so now, if you look at family production in the United States, you'll see that it's at historically low levels, and it is headed straight down, basically all throughout the second half of the 20th century and to where we are today. And Tim, if you bear in mind that culture is never static, it's always going someplace. I think if you look at where we were in 56 and then see where we are in 2016, you can see we've made a long trajectory, long pathway. But imagine where we'll be in another 50 years. And I think the latest meme is pedophilia. I can see that pedophilia is now being normalized. There's slowly a kind of breaking down of the moral resistance to it. And I do think that it's where one of the things that you'll see in the future is that the laws around pedophilia will start to break down. So, all of this ends up, of course, with genocide and then extinction because, now the Europeans are not at replicant rate. We're not even close. I was listening to a podcast the other day about Europe and England's birth rates, the native populations, and they're just collapsing. There really won't be any European population in 100 years at the current trends continue, and you have to remember that we were told that there was a population bomb and that there was a baby boomer. Notice the psychological negative terms that are used against trying to tell people that there's overpopulation. Well, obviously, if you look at the Rockefeller and Roosevelt participation in this, you can see that the oligarchs have always wanted to reduce the European population. And then, of course, this was after World War I and World War II, which were, even though they're famous, at least World War II is very famous as, the Holocaust of the Jewish captives. In fact, it was the whole century was a Holocaust of the European. One of my research projects is trying to find out how many Europeans died in the 20th century from war and related events. And, you can't even get within 20 million of the correct number because it's somewhere between, the top end would be like 250 million and maybe the bottom end is 180 million. But it's just incredible that there isn't, a rounding error is 10 million people. I mean, this is how catastrophic the century was. And so, when I, look at the malfeasance that you can clearly see operating against, what can be called European culture, my question is like, were the world wars just part of this project? There is pretty good evidence, rises to a very high level of suspicion that the wars were just faked. And that what happened was the secret society had determined that they wanted to reduce European populations. And so they just, using their control over the political class, ran the armies into one another and held them there and just slaughtered them. So, we're dealing with very grim facts and conjecture. Citizens need to be alert. Citizens need to spend more time trying to research their history and also just need to be alert to the fact that there's malfeasance in the government.
Now, yes, you of course, you were talking about Alfred Kinsey at the start here, and he is known as one of the fathers of the sexual revolution because he published these books that had an academic veneer to them. The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, that was, I think, 1948. And 5 years later, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Of course, the methodology has long since been, been justifiably dismissed.
It's a crackpot.
Nevertheless, he receives, all the support of officialdom and the establishment. He becomes this cult figure. As you said, he's cited by Playboy magazine, another probably intelligence-linked magazine, because they, I think, surreptitiously, not surreptitiously, just on coincidence, Hugh Hefner acquired the nude photographs of Marilyn Monroe just when she was becoming a star, which put Playboy on the map.
Yeah, I've never
It's
bought the Playboy story. I don't have any, evidence, but I've never bought it. And the more I look at that part of history in a general sense, the more certain I am that whole thing was just an op. And I'll reference the fact that, one of the trademarks of the oligarchs is to see Europeans as animals. That's one of the ways they characterize, like you see Walt Disney with his Mouseketeers, and Shakespeare, referring to them as pigs. And then, of course, Hugh Hefner has the bunny. But I think that fits into basically what can be called neuro-linguistic programming, and it's just a way to present images to the culture of women in a debased and animal state that are positive. It's a very cool thing to be a bunny. The CIA agent Gloria Steinem, she was photographed, in a bunny outfit. Mm-hmm. This is supposed to be a feminist. So, that's how I would look at Playboy, is just clearly, it's hard to imagine it was circumstantial. And, I would think it just needs a little scrutiny. Some research need to go in and just, pin down Hefner's connections into, basically the government operation against our culture.
Sure. And now Kinsey, of course, his research, as you alluded to or mentioned earlier, it involved, supposedly getting the data from pedophiles and I guess
sex diaries, yeah.
Sex diaries, because that's a crime. That's evidence of a crime.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence that he paid these people for their behavior, correct?
Right. I know, which is just absolutely insane. But I think, the really interesting character that Kinsey is connected to, is Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
And there is actual primary documentation, real citations, people who were there in the room wrote about it, that Kinsey attempted to buy Aleister Crowley's sex diaries, and in fact may have. And, they don't have that as a data that I've ever been able to find a citation about, but those that were there are certain that Kinsey was attempting to get Crowley's diary because he knew Crowley was a pedophile, and he wanted to see, and I don't. It's like, to go into some of these details is almost too disgusting, for people to discuss. But Kinsey would attempt to characterize the orgasms or sexual response of the child participant, which included trying to strike the adult who was raping them, in essence.
It's called self-defense.
Right, and these were characterized as attributes of the child orgasm, right? Because that was one of Kinsey's discoveries, is that children had orgasms at a younger age than people believed. This kind of sexual latency period was not, according to Kinsey, real, and that there was all this sexual activity that children were having that we were unaware of. And so they, according to Kinsey's approach, where he's just taking them objectively as a scientist, and he's describing these actions as as related to orgasms, when the fact is, you just look at these facts and you can see that the poor children are trying to get away from a rapist. So to describe Kinsey as a crackpot is euphemistic. I mean, he is basically a maniac and a psychopath. And so the fact that someone who would, produce this kind of data then became one of basically the founders of the modern sex, drug, and rock and roll culture, it just shows that, there's malfeasance, in its production from the very beginning.
Yeah, it only stands to figure that his views or values would be diluted as they were, injected into the culture, but they nevertheless would have their deleterious effects.
Sure.
And eventually it would poison the well.
Right. Well, they just repeat negative, concepts that are too absurd to even, be in polite company over time can be normalized.
Well, just like today, I read today, there's a headline that Joe Biden presided over a wedding of 2 male White House staffers.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean,
just 5 years ago, that would have been ridiculous, right?
Yeah, look at how they're promoting Bruce Jenner.
Yeah.
I mean, they promoting him as a hero. And, you see, if you look at the statistics for homosexuality that Kinsey was citing, other researchers weren't even getting 1/10 the number he was, or were getting 1/10 the number. But, today I wonder, because the culture has become indoctrinal in terms of getting, males to think of homosexuality as a viable sexual perspective. And then they have damaged the male's physical sexuality.
Yeah.
The sperm count of Europeans is, it's catastrophically lower than it was 70, 80 years ago, perhaps as much as 50%.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And so in addition, you have less testosterone, but you also have these estrogen mimicry chemicals. They come from plastics typically, and they give males with a much higher level of estrogen. So you've had these gender benders, toxins that have been interjected into our environment, and they are definitely affecting, the production of fully formed males. And so
you also have sexual confusion, because if you have dysfunctional families, people
Sure.
look at the cause of sexual confusion, homosexuality. One is ambivalent or distant fathers, or fathers just aren't around, or abuse, a trauma. And in broken families, you have much higher rates of those two things, and you're going to produce more confused or traumatized individuals that might express itself in homosexuality.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a sick, malevolent soup with, dozens of components in it and dozens of ingredients that are all damaging young people, both men and women, as they grow up.
What was that play? Damaged goods that Bernays popularized?
Exactly right. I mean, it's just fascinating that way back when, at the beginning of the 20th century, when you really started to see organized malevolence, and this is beginning with this character Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, a weird double nephew of Sigmund Freud. I won't go into the family details, but it's both sides of Bernays' family were related to Freud. He had a very close relationship with his uncle, and of course, was using the psychological science against culture. And he really brought out the what I regard as the most noticeable origin of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture with this his production of a play called Damaged Goods, which had a lot of overt sexual material in it. Damaged Goods was defended by the New York Times, and who they praised the play. They called it Sex O'Clock in America. Very prescient, that comment. And then it was funded by the Rockefellers, as always, and attended and supported by the Roosevelts, who were also in the audience at opening night. So, when you piece all of these facts together, trying to see, how did we get from the year 1905 to this point? Basically, you can see that culture was deformed deliberately by a collection of oligarchs and, their agents, and you can really identify them pretty clearly. You can actually go through from the different strands. So Bernays was one strand. In Europe, you had Gregor Lukács, who was a Jewish individual. He was a member of the Comintern, the Communist International Party. He was given control over culture of Hungary following World War I for a period of time, and he attempted to basically change the sexual mores of high school students wanted to create a more free love kind of lifestyle.
This was during the regime of what, Bela Kun?
I'm not sure. It would have been. I mean, he was in operation in 1918. I'd have to go back.
I think it would be Bela Kun. Yeah, the short
probably would. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Lucas, I mean, he was like a modern Marxist. In other words, he was saying, basically the revolution of the proletariat doesn't look like it's going to happen, but we do really want to bring about that political control over the masses that Marx, was so desirous to bring about. And so they created what was, kind of a neo-Marxism, which came out of what was called the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School were just a bunch of people who wanted to transform culture. They wanted to bring about the change and the political control that Marx envisioned through what they called, or has been called, the long march through culture. They wanted to take over the institutions of the political institutions that controlled sexual laws, education particularly. They wanted to control, and then they developed what was called critical theory, which is just basically criticizing every single thing about European culture. I mean, critical theory is just another crackpot, idea that has no, it's just a way. It just provides a veneer of, like science or philosophy for someone who wants to shatter culture. And so the Frankfurt School, was founded in Europe. It was originally funded through the Comintern, but then it left Europe and came to the United States. For some reason, the American Jewish Committee that was interested after World War II in trying to develop sort of a psychological understanding of fascism and also of things that were dangerous to Jewish people. They basically hired the Frankfurt School lock, stock, and barrel. A few of them didn't participate, but a great many of them did in this thing called the authoritarian personality, which developed a lot of psychological profile technology. This was actually kind of the beginning of the science of mass marketing. They had these different psychological scales. One of them was the anti-Semitic scale, where you would take, would answer a bunch of questions and you'd get a number as to where you rated on a scale. They had a fascism scale. You'd look at it, you'd answer a bunch of questions, and then out would pop your, whether or not you were likely to become a fascist. They had an ethnocentric scale to see, well, how attached are you to your ethnicity, which evidently was a bad idea. And so that was, in my opinion, morally hard to justify, because basically what it was trying to do is to find technical means to control people without telling them. They wrote what was called the authoritarian personality, which described some of the scales and how the psychology was developed. And, just to maybe perhaps get a little bit ahead of what we'll be discussing, but the school, the Frankfurt School, and then the group that is hired by the American Jewish Committee, many of them end up related to what was called the Macy Conference, which then becomes MK Ultra, which was a secret or part of this debasement of culture, right? MK Ultra is was now, I think there's been enough discoveries that there really isn't any way to dispute this, that MK Ultra was basically looking at a way to produce the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture that America has been damaged by. And so I did not understand the moral basis for the project. When I did research into Gordon Wasson, and you can look in articles I've written, like Manufacturing the Deadhead, you can see the pay requisitions from MK Ultra employing Gordon Wasson to begin the counterculture. The Life magazine article, the May 1957 article, which begins the counterculture, was a CIA project. It was Subproject 58. Documentation exists. It's just clear as a bell. So, you have to wonder, well, how could anyone have really the moral authority to basically damage that many human beings? So where does this organized psychosis come from? And in looking backwards in time at some of the individuals who were part of MKUltra, like Nevitt Stanford, who was at the Stanford Research Institute, and Adorno and Horkheimer, I'm mispronouncing his name, people that were involved in the final version of what damaged culture. Going backwards, I found that they had been part of this American Jewish Committee project, the authoritarian personality. And then when I read their documents, I came to the conclusion, which is chapter 23 of the authoritarian personality, if your listeners want to read along, and then I found the following statement at the conclusion, and I'll just read it. It says, resistance to self-insight and resistance to social facts are contrived, most essentially of the same stuff. It is here that psychology may play its most important role. Techniques for overcoming resistance, developed mainly in the field of individual psychotherapy, can be improved and adapted for use with groups and even for use on a mass scale. Now, folks, this is fascism. I mean, this is just bold-faced fascism, because what they're saying is that they are justified in using psychological techniques against people who are not aware that they're being used, and using them on a mass scale. And so then they conclude in the next paragraph, they then make this schmarmy justification, right, for what they're doing. They go, thus, we need not suppose that appeal to emotion, right, now that basically they're just saying being malevolent. Thus, we need not suppose that appeal to emotion belongs to those who strive in the direction of fascism, while democratic propaganda must limit itself to reason and restraint. Now, there it is, right? That they do not have to limit themselves to reason, and they aren't restrained by concern of basically of changing and damaging the minds of those that they're bringing the techniques against. I'll just read it again. Every citizen should know this sentence. It goes, thus, we need not suppose that appeal to emotion belongs to those who strive in the direction of fascism, while democratic propaganda must limit itself to reason and restraint. And then they conclude, it goes, if fear and destructiveness are the major emotional sources of fascism, eros belongs mainly to democracy. So in other words, they're saying, look, we want the same control over the population, the same mind control that the fascists use, but we're not going to do fear and destructiveness. We're going to use eros as democratic propaganda. And see, then MKUltra produces the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture. And I maintain that there is a clear, logical relationships between these statements and the Macy Conference, where so many of these people end up, and then on to MKUltra. And I'll just reference one of the authors of this was Nevitt Stanford, who then was actually related to MKUltra. To the Macy Conference, and then worked with MKUltra. He worked at the Stanford Research Institute. He produced a book which promoted psychedelic drug use. Lazarfield, who's also another one of the authors, is referenced in MKUltra documents as producing psychology that is beneficial to the program. So, I mean, it is not evidence of a kind that you can say, well, look, I want a conviction, but it is evidence, and it's strong enough, and I think, there's enough weight, in fact, that it should raise the suspicion to a really high level. And the citizens should just demand that, the MK Ultra project, that the science that the Macy Foundation, the Macy conferences were producing, and the science that the authoritarian personality of the American Jewish Committee was advocating, that the relationships between these things need to be brought to the public. There needs to be a real public, and I mean I'm not talking about the government doing it, because that would just be letting them give themselves their own grade, but rather a process that the public could trust, that would be objective and independent, to go into the relationships between these things, because I think there's enough evidence here to everyone should be frightened at the very least, and everyone should be curious as just as a function of citizenry.
Yes. Now you've mentioned one thing you say, the authoritarian personality. It claimed to I guess identify the sources of fascism, which ended up being traditional Christian, patriarchal families.
It's hard not to. The thing is that
so the solution
they bring out the scales, but it's so crackpot that and it's so malevolent. It's just so racist that
it's ethnic.
It's hard really to like separate the science of what they're doing from their craziness.
It's a declaration of ethnic warfare.
Yeah, I mean it can certainly be looked at that, and it's a kind of it's either just an overt ethnic warfare that keeps itself hidden, or it's just a kind of arrogance that the other ethnicity is so little valued that the fact that you're spending millions of dollars developing this mental control over them is just not anything that you would even have a moral question about. It's just absolutely sick, and it really the way that it has come into our government. And remember, MK Ultra was never vetted. Helms destroyed the documents. Church committee asked for, we want every single piece of paper you've got. When they found out that they were giving LSD to citizens without the citizens knowing it, they knew they had a rogue problem inside the CIA, and they demanded the documentation. Helms destroyed it and said, I was afraid of embarrassing my friends. So that was just a bad moment for democracy. We lost at that point. But I think it just showed, who was in charge, that the democracy we think we've had and have been told we've had is in fact fake, that they've had through the media particularly, control over the political culture. They've been able to create the candidates they want. And, we get to vote on issues like same-sex marriage and, abortion, but control over money and warfare belongs to them.
Yeah. Now, and of course, I think there was Frank Church, who died, I think, of a heart attack at the ripe old age of like 52 or 53 or something.
Yeah, so. Pity. It's funny how that happens.
Funny. After looking at the heart attack gun, I have to have it on film where him and Goldwater are looking at that.
Like, what was Tim Russert? Russert was the really courageous television commentator and interviewer, and he asked both Kerry and Bush Jr. What were the oaths that they took when they were members of Skull and Bones, and both of them, refused to answer. But Russert said, well, what does this mean for democracy? And Kerry gave him an icy glare, and he said, well, secrecy. He says, I wish I could manifest something secret for you. I mean, that was a threat, and it got executed.
Yes, and he died.
I haven't seen the autopsy, but this would just be something that I would just put into my, my understanding is just obviously they got rid of someone who was a real journalist. Now,
it's quite a chilling effect. But the irony is that the American Jewish Committee, in the authoritarian personality, in the name of fighting fascism, they are invoking or advocating fascist or authoritarian methods.
Exactly. Well, they're saying we're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to use sex, drugs, and rock and roll rather than fear. So, in other words, what they're saying is the way that fascism used intimidation, terrorism, and all of these rationales to mind control the population, we're going to do the same thing. We're not going to be limited by reason and restraint. We're just going to use a different method. We're going to use Woodstock as opposed to, the storyline that the Nazis gave to the German people.
Yeah, and because that's the observation that Aldous Huxley made in Brave New World, where as sexual freedom expands, political freedom contracts. Wilhelm Reich, another one of the Frankfurt School, wrote. I think he wrote the fascism. What was that book he wrote on fascism?
Yeah.
But his idea was, in order to change the political constitution, you had to upend the sexual constitution.
Right. I mean, this is kind of these ideas are everywhere, throughout the people who are trying to influence culture. They're always trying to put into, the idea out there that sex is the real driver of culture. And the more they just want everyone to have sex on their brain. Huxley was, obviously a malevolent, puppet, or no, a puppet. He was part of the oligarchy, very close friends with the Rothschilds. In fact, there's someone who recorded, Huxley's conversation at a party with the Rothschild. This was last name was Berlin. And he said, Huxley would talk about humans as though they were basically like units of, numbers or something, And then when you look at Brave New World, you look at it closely, you can see that, in addition to all the Freemason cryptic symbolism that he has in it, it's just sickening how much of it is in there. He's really, he's not expressing, trying to alert the population to the dangers of this coming control by the oligarchs using technology. He's actually just describing the plan, and just putting it out there and normalizing it as something that everyone can experience. And in fact, he's really saying that, well, this is a better way to live. You can live as a delta or as a beta, and basically as a caste slave to the oligarchs. And what's good about that is that it's socially stable. That you're not going to have to worry about wars or anything like that. There'll just be complete control. And then of course, when you see Huxley's participation in MK Ultra, then it just becomes terrifying. The citizen should read Brave New World and experience rage, because what you're really looking at is the justification and the plan that they are going to implement upon European culture.
Yeah.
That's what the Brave New World is. I would hope people read the paper I wrote on The Tempest, the Shakespearean play where Huxley gets the expression Brave New World. And there you can see the Shakespearean literature is this very malevolent, hard to understand, kind of stuff. But I decode this in the book Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. And when you understand the framework that Huxley is using the term Brave New World from, it's, you're really looking at a very, very psychopathic, program that we're being subjected to. And then when you look at Huxley's, his connections into MK Ultra, his connections into the oligarch family, the long-standing tradition that his family has with eugenics, right? So it's a way of identifying Huxley as a way of identifying his associations are all evil, basically. All of these people, and then of course the amazing fact that Huxley and his MK Ultra doctor friend Stanley Osmond, they're the ones who hired Tim Leary to become the counterculture puppet and, court jester of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll world. I mean, they actually hired him, and there's a video, it's called I refer to it as the MK Ultra Union Party, but I think it's just a conversation about LSD. And it was a party in the 70s that was filmed, and they're having a few drinks, and he actually talks, Stanley Orman talks about the day that, and Larry's right there next to him. He's actually talking to Tim Leary, and he says, I remember the day that Aldous and I hired you. So, I mean, this is, when you start laying the facts next to, what we know about their public life and their so-called scientific life, when you start putting now the facts that researchers have uncovered about MK Ultra, about Aldous Huxley, about all of the oligarchic control of all of this, you can really get a clear picture of how our culture was shattered, how malevolent they are, and how really genocide is the program. I mean, they're not, Huxley talks about people being reduced to deltas and, betas and whatnot. Believe me, the robots will be handling all that stuff. They're definitely going to depopulate. In fact, one of the things that I would just point out, just an obvious, observation, is if you notice that recently they've the EU has immigrated millions of young Muslim men into Europe. Why are they doing this? Well, what's going to happen is they will pull the plug on the economy at some point, and then you'll have food shortages, and basically Europe will just be turned into a gladiatorial pit. And these two groups who will have been manipulated by the media into a high level of hatred for one another will simply slaughter each other.
Which is why you have these events.
Yep. And so that's
whether it's a truck or something, or a shooting, or
Yeah. So you're going to see these groups will be manipulated into basically a war against one another, while the oligarchs sit in their, their pavilion seats and cheer us on while we slaughter each other.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned, one thing is you mentioned the Tempest, and where people put into a dream state. I can't help but think of, the term the American dream, right?
Of course, yeah. I mean, it comes right out. But the Tempest, it's I don't know how lay people can read Shakespeare, and I'm not sure what they get out of it. The plays are basically incoherent if you don't understand the framework that the author is generating the symbols out of. In the Tempest, the whole play is based on Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, the character Ariel, the tempest itself, the word, the tempest, the dream states that the Gentiles are put into. These are all basically elements right out of Isaiah 29. And then it moves into the drunkenness, which then is reflected in the play, and then it also has little things like, Ariel is under the ground, and this then is reflected in the play as voice of Ariel coming from underneath the ground, and all of the symbolic level comes out of the Old Testament, and then you go on to the Apocalypse, where Isaiah describes a world where basically the Gentiles have been first put into a dream and then exterminated. And this is then reflected in the play. It's done so kind of cryptically, and if you read the article, you can see my take on all this. But it's pretty clear cut because I recently had some criticism saying, well, it's you're just seeing patterns that don't exist. But the problem is that I'm not. The problem is that when I show that the symbolism as you go into the later part of the play is just following the pattern of the reliance on Isaiah that is known to everyone who studies the play carefully. That is in the first part of the play, that the title and the characters are all coming right out of Isaiah. I just show that no, it's not. It doesn't end halfway through the play. It goes all the way through, and then of course now you're looking at a Holocaust of the Gentiles.
Yeah, I guess.
So now when you take Aldous Huxley's use of the term, Huxley is very familiar with the actual real correct interpretive level of Shakespeare, and he's just basically reusing the concept, and he's talking about the dream state. And it's just in here, the dream state is being manifested mechanically by psychological techniques, whereas in Isaiah, Isaiah wasn't able to envision, I think, these devices, but, Huxley is aware of them, and he's claiming that, the Brave New World is really a manifestation of this, apocalyptic prophecy that occurs in Isaiah.
Now, the dream state that Shakespeare writes of, I guess today we could interpret the dream state as consumerism, sex,
Sure.
sports, and things like that.
Absolutely, yep. Absolutely.
Amusements and entertainment, things like that.
Distraction.
Yeah. And, of course, other people have written about, I think it was Postman who wrote the book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Was it Postman?
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, about that. And, these are amusements, and of course, amusements are designed to make us not think critically, right? Amusement, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting, that would be in there so early on. Now, of course, with your research, you've made the connection with the American Jewish Committee and the authoritarian personality. It seems that Kinsey was promoted to advance that agenda by promoting.
It's a very logical, position. I mean.
But the important thing is it predates World War II, and that the justification for the authoritarian personality is the trauma and the experience of the Second World War and how the Jews suffered during the war. But if it predates it,
exactly right. I mean that's a very important point. Is that if you look at the authoritarian personality, I mean a normal human would think that the people who produce this are basically racist and crazy.
Yeah.
However, following World War II, their position had a kind of cover that was provided by the Holocaust, and that's why studying the individual Gregor Lucas is so important, and the Frankfurt School, because they predated the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. They were developing these techniques, which then are leading to the authoritarian personality following World War I. And of course, looking at Edward Bernays and the damage that he begins to the culture in like 1910. So it's very, very important.
And his uncle, Freud.
Freud, right, yeah. And the whole Tavistock, collection of individuals that are.
I think Freud said when he was introducing psychoanalysis to the United States, I'm bringing them the plague.
Right. That's a quote from a person he was traveling with.
Yeah.
It's primary. In other words, the guy did make the claim, but Freud didn't write it. In a letter or something. But the fact is, that's what was happening.
But the point is, if you analyze Freud's ideas, well, neurosis came from guilt, and guilt came from moral inhibition, particularly regarding sex. So the one way you cure your neurosis is you bring in sexual freedom. I mean, that's a black op against traditional Christians.
Exactly right. And I mean, Freud is another absolute crackpot. Yeah. Things like the Oedipal complex. I mean, none of this stuff has ever been replicated by any actual researcher. You have to look at people like Freud and Marx as being lifetime actors. What their role is to produce, what stands some scrutiny as, supposedly science, but is in fact just ways to politically dominate and culturally debase.
Well, no, vaccines are based on science, right?
Vaccines, yeah, right. Yeah, I'd love to take vaccines. I mean, here in California, they're trying to make it mandatory for school children. And it's just really hard-edged fascism now. It's sad to see this happen because...
They're taking off the velvet, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, just think of it this way. I mean, like, how often has evil controlled the political landscape in our history? I mean, it just happens all the time. And the idea of giving the government the legal right to inject children with whatever they want, I mean, that's just obviously not just asking for trouble. It's demanding that at some point you'll be wiped out, because at some point, even if the current crop were not malevolent, which of course is ludicrous, at some point there will be. And then these laws will be easily used to, these people are too smart and I would like my slaves to be dumber. And so I know just what vaccines to put in there. In other words, all you have to do is merge this law with evil and you've got a population that no longer exists. So, that's why.
And they're using the public school system.
And they use the public school system, right. And then of course they've got the crackpot vaccine, rationale, which, they're saying, well, you're endangering all of these people. Well, if the vaccines work, why don't just let them be vaccinated? Then they don't have to worry about catching it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is they don't work. And, there's a really good, data set that I always, mention that, people look at. And it's, it's, basically, where is that? Yeah, it's called Dissolving Illusions.
Oh, Susan Humphreys, yeah.
Right, and what she's done is she's gotten the data sets for 51 diseases, and then she charts at which point the vaccine was introduced and what the results were, and you can see that virtually in no case was the trajectory of the mortality from the disease, which in all cases was heading down because you had better sanitation and a lot of other elements that were improving health, and they were the causal factors. But in no case did the vaccine change the vector. So why has vaccination become, so beloved by the oligarchs? Well, I'm afraid to say it's because they could see that eventually they'd be able to create technology where Huxley's vision could be implemented.
Was it Bertrand Russell who said that through diet injunctions and injections?
Yeah. I've noticed that, I was calling the attention of all of these survivor shows over the last few years. You see these survivor shows and they're just normalizing a post-electric world where the European is, naked and afraid. They have a show, it's actually called Naked and Afraid, where people who don't know each other, right, a man and a woman, are forced to live without anything, and they just head out into the wilderness with no clothes on. And what this does is just normalizes the attributes of the post-electric world, so that we can then walk into our future without complaining.
Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.tv.